Hello, everyone. This presentation is on the Vulcan Accelerator, Adventures with Adverse Effects. Please welcome Michelle Casagni.
Hi, thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining this talk. I'll be talking about the Adverse Event resource and how it's used in clinical care and clinical research. My name is Michelle Casagni, and I'm a software engineer and health informaticist working for the MITRE Corporation. A lot of my work has been with HL7 Fire accelerators. I'm working the oncology standards with the Codex Accelerator and adverse event standards with Vulcan. So first, just let me introduce what the Vulcan Fire Accelerator is. Vulcan serves the needs of the clinical and translational research communities, working to bridge the gap with clinical care through fire standards. Vulcan is a member-driven community that supports projects and events that aim to educate and also develop standards for exchanging data that's been curated through clinical care processes to make it usable for clinical research. Vulcan has an international scope with over 40 members from pharma, academia, technology vendors, regulators, and standards development organizations. So since we'll be talking about adverse events, let me just kind of put some definitions out there. Broadly, an adverse event is an unattended effect on a patient due to medical care or the use of a medical product. However, when we talk about clinical research and clinical care, each of these have more specific definitions. An adverse event for clinical research is any unfavorable sign, symptom, or disease that's associated with a study drug, whether or not it's considered related to that drug of interest. This is quite different from clinical care, where an adverse event is a patient experiencing harm from unsafe or poor quality healthcare. These events are more related to the patient's safety, and they're often categorized as preventable or negligence. And if the harm results in if the adverse event results in no harm, then it's considered a near miss or an error. Another difference between clinical care and clinical research is the notion of a serious adverse event. In clinical research, a serious adverse event must be reported within a specific time frame, and that's so it can be reviewed by institutional review boards and data safety monitoring boards. An event is considered serious if any of these criteria or one or more of these criteria are present during the adverse event. Similarly, tracking of adverse events is also different between clinical care and clinical research. Now, all of these differences between the definitions and how they're tracked is what makes it challenging for the base adverse event fire resource to be used to capture them. For clinical care, tracking is to support the reporting of incidents and quality assurance within an organization, whereas in clinical research, it's about tracking potential effects of the study drug and being able to report those for regulatory agencies, clinical research, and the sponsors of the drug. Additionally, in clinical care, potential or avoided near-miss events are tracked, but in clinical research settings, potential adverse events are not reported. So how is all of this used? Well, the Adverse Event Fire resource is owned by the Patient Care Working Group, but when we start talking about clinical research, the Biomedical Research and Regulation Working Group is involved in it. So after several years of discussion on how to manage the two differences between clinical care and clinical research for reporting adverse events, it was decided to just further profile the base adverse event resource to meet the needs of these specific use cases. So the Vulcan Fire Accelerator stood up an adverse events project team, and that project team is currently working on implementation guides for each of these settings. The clinical care implementation guide will support hospitals and clinics, and the clinical research implementation guide will create the parameters for supporting clinical research trials within a regulated environment. There's also anticipation that a future implementation guide can be developed to support the Food and Drug Administration's MedWatch program, which would further define the adverse event research profile with additional fire resources so that serious adverse events can be communicated to the FDA using fire. This Venn diagram doesn't include all the data elements in the profile or the adverse event resource. It is meant to highlight the commonalities and differences between clinical care and clinical research. So as you can see, there's several attributes that are common in the center here: the event that occurred, when it occurred, the subject that it occurred for, what the suspect and cause of that adverse event was and the outcome. But when you start looking at clinical care, there's much fewer data elements than there are in clinical research. The clinical care implementation guide in that profile is actually constraining out those adverse event elements that are related to research. So seriousness, study, expected in research are not part of the clinical care profile. And at this time, there's no additional extensions in the clinical care IG for an adverse event. In clinical research, the adverse event needs to define the data elements needed to support the workflow for collecting and reporting serious and non-serious adverse events to meet the needs of the regulatory submissions. So we've added several extensions that are, some of them are listed here, and also many of the codable concepts within the adverse event profile. We constrained the value sets and put appropriate bindings on them so that we have the values coming through that are expected for clinical research. So next, I'll walk you through a few examples for each of these use cases. First, let me caveat, I know there's a lot of words on the screen here, and really for readability and simplicity, I put the key adverse event data elements into a table as opposed to trying to put JSON code into a slide. Complete examples with JSON and XML formats are available in the implementation guides, and I have a slide with the link so you can actually go to the IGs if you want to see this in code. So here we have a clinical care example where a patient is going for a routine colonoscopy. 2 days after the procedure, the patient experienced a fever and abdominal pain, and they returned to the doctor. It's discovered that the patient was injured during the procedure, and then so further treatment was done and the patient has recovered. So mapping this to the clinical care implementation guide, the category would be a procedure mishap. The event is that there's a fever and localized abdominal pain. And so the patient or the subject here in the resource would be a patient fire resource, Mrs. Jones. The occurrence is the date that it occurred. The suspect entity was the actual procedure, the polypectomy with electrocautery, and it's probably likely to that procedure that these adverse event occurred. The resulting effect is injury to the bowel that caused a burn and local peritonitis, and the outcome is that the patient is recovering, and it was mitigated by providing antibiotics and intravenous hydration. This next example is an error that caused no harm. So here a patient is given a dose of vitamin D that was intended for another patient. The patient that received the vitamin D experienced no symptoms and had no underlying conditions that would cause an adverse event by taking vitamin D. So here, when this gets mapped to the clinical care implementation guide profile, the category is wrong patient and the event is the administration of the vitamin D. Again, our subject is the patient Arnold Bear, and the occurrence is the date it happened. The suspect entity is the administration of this medication, and the causality is certain because it was administered. The outcome here is that the patient didn't experience any effects, so the resulting effect is none. And then for mitigating action, it was recorded in the patient's record that this medication was administered, and an incident report is recorded in the hospital's incident reporting system. So now switching to clinical research, this is an example of a serious adverse event. So a patient's on a clinical trial, they're taking a study drug, and they are hospitalized for a gastrointestinal bleed. The situation is resolved by cauterizing the bleed and stopping the study drug. The clinical investigator indicates that the study drug is possibly related to this GI bleed. And since it's a serious adverse event, we need to specify the criteria that made it serious. So here, when we map this to, now we're over in the clinical research implementation guide, so it's a different profile, and the event is the gastrointestinal bleed. The patient or the subject here is the patient that's on the study. We have an occurrence of the date it started and then when it was resolved. This adverse event was indicated as serious, so we also need to specify the seriousness criteria that indicates that it's serious. So here, it was life-threatening, the patient was hospitalized, and it required intervention. In clinical research, the events are also categorized with severity or grade. So this adverse event was severe. The suspect entity, it's a clinical research study. So the suspect entity is the study medication, and the clinical investigator indicates that the GI bleed is possibly related to that medication. The patient's recovering. And the mitigating action was that the study drug was withdrawn. And again, since this is clinical research, we also want to include the research study that is involved for this adverse event. This example is also a clinical research example, but it's for a non-serious adverse event. Here, the patient is experiencing intermittent headaches that are mild. The investigator doesn't believe the headaches are related to the study drug, so they do not change the dose. The difference here too is that since this is a non-serious adverse event, we don't need to specify seriousness criteria because they are not relevant in this example. So here, mapping this to the clinical research adverse event profile, the event is the headache. Again, the subject is the patient. The date it occurred, it's non-serious. The headaches are mild. The suspect entity, because it's a research study, again, is the study medication. However, it's unlikely related to that medication. So the result is that the dose is not changed. The outcome is not recovering because the patient is still experiencing the headaches, and we assign the research study here. So in summary, this presentation highlighted the differences with adverse events for clinical care and clinical research. These differences make it hard to use a single resource to model them, so a profile is being created for each of these use cases. This is where the Vulcan Adverse Event project is coming in. We are currently developing an adverse event clinical research implementation guide that will be balloted in September 2023. And we also drafted an adverse event clinical care implementation guide that we handed over to the HL7 patient care work group so that they can finish building that out, modeling it, and testing it for more specific examples related to clinical care. And this just ends with my contact information. There's information to reach out to the Vulcan PMO Program Management Office. I have links to the adverse event project, a link to the implementation guides that I talked to here, and some more specific adverse event use cases. And several of these use cases on this page were also the ones that were modeled in the implementation guide. And I'll stop there for questions.
Michelle, people online, you can leave questions in the Whova app, but I'm going to start with questions in the room. Any questions? It looks like we have no questions in Whova. So thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you.